Passengers thought they were watching an inconvenience play out, but behind those uneasy stares was a story that would ripple far beyond the aisles. Wealth, reputation, and corporate power all became entangled with one child's determination not to be pushed aside. Every detail of that confrontation carried consequences, each one tightening a net that would soon catch more than just one man's arrogance. Amara Jenkins was an 11-year-old black girl whose presence always seemed to spark a reaction in those around her, not because of anything she did wrong, but because she carried herself with a confidence and intelligence that most adults did not expect from someone her age. Her skin was the warm shade of polished mahogany, her eyes deep pools of focus and curiosity, and her braids hung neatly down her shoulders, each strand a silent statement of identity and resilience. On that morning, she looked like any other child boarding a flight with her father, but in truth she was not any ordinary passenger. Amara was a billionaire, the prodigy behind Dreamscape, a global educational technology company that had already changed how children learned across the world. Yet none of that mattered as she stepped onto flight 1382 bound for San Francisco. To the crew and passengers, she was just a black child in a space they had decided she did not belong. In her hand, Amara clutched her boarding pass tightly, the letters and numbers crisp and unambiguous. 2A, first class, window seat. Her father, Marcus Jenkins, deliberately booked himself in economy 3 rows behind, wanting his daughter to experience the independence of traveling first class alone while he remained close enough to intervene if needed. It was his quiet lesson in balance, that privilege should be appreciated, never taken for granted. As Amara walked confidently toward her seat, her small carry-on rolling behind her, her blazer slightly oversized but still sharp, she felt that familiar mixture of nervousness and determination that always accompanied big trips. She imagined reviewing her presentation notes once seated, maybe sipping the apple juice she always ordered on flights, and gazing out the window to calm herself before facing the venture capitalists of Sunset. But instead of finding an empty seat waiting for her, she froze. A man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, an expensive suit wrinkled from haste, and a scowl carved into his face was already sitting in 2A. His briefcase lay shoved beneath the seat, his laptop half open on the tray, his body angled as if to declare ownership of the space. Amara hesitated. Then, with the practiced politeness her father had taught her, she said, "Excuse me, sir. I think that's my seat." The man barely glanced up before smirking. "I don't think so," he said, his voice clipped, dismissive. Amara's heart skipped, but she steadied herself, holding out her boarding pass. "It says 2A. The bold black ink glared back undeniably. The man's frown deepened, his jaw tightening as if her presence alone was an affront. "I specifically booked this seat. There must be some mistake." The passengers nearby began to sense the tension, eyes flicking up from magazines, phones slipping from hands, a subtle hush spreading through the cabin. A flight attendant approached, her professional smile stretched thin, her name tag reading Sandra. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, tone clipped but carrying the weight of authority. "Yes," the man replied quickly, cutting Amara off before she could speak. "This girl is in my seat." Sandra extended her hand for the boarding passes. Amara, her fingers trembling slightly, passed hers over. The man shoved his forward impatiently. Sandra scanned both, her expression flickering as she realized the truth. "Miss Jenkins is correctly seated in 2A, she said carefully. "Sir, your ticket says 12C, Economy Plus." A ripple of whispers swept through the cabin, but the man did not relent. His voice rose with indignation, his words sharp enough to cut the air. "I've been a platinum member for 15 years. I never fly economy. This is ridiculous." Amara felt her cheeks burn as eyes turned toward her, some curious, some judgmental, and some pitying. Sandra's composure faltered as she looked back at Amara, then at the man. "Perhaps," she began, her voice too soft, "the young lady could take another seat in economy so that you can remain here, sir." The suggestion landed like a slap. Amara stared at her ticket again, her pulse quickening. She had the right to be here. She had earned this seat not just with money, but with the brilliance that built her company, with nights coding until dawn, with determination stronger than most adults possessed. Yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. She was being reduced to what they saw, a black child occupying a space they believed she did not deserve. From the economy section, Marcus had been watching closely. The subtle shift in his daughter's posture, the redness creeping up her neck, the trembling in her hand, he recognized all of it. Without hesitation, he stood and strode forward, his presence commanding. At 48, with broad shoulders and an aura of quiet authority, he was not a man easily ignored. "My daughter's seat," he said firmly, voice calm but edged with steel, "was purchased weeks ago. She has the boarding pass to prove it." Sandra's eyes darted nervously between father and daughter, between truth and confrontation. The man crossed his arms, sneering. "I paid for first class. I'm not giving up my seat to accommodate some disruption." The man sneering at her, Richard Blackwell, saw only a child, a supposed disruption, someone who did not fit the picture of first-class clientele he believed should sit in that coveted window seat, but he was blind to the truth that Amara had built something greater than anything he could imagine. Marcus Jenkins, her father, remained standing protectively by her side, calm but with storm clouds in his eyes, refusing to let his daughter be diminished, and though the whispers of passengers swirled through the air like a rising tide of judgment, Amara straightened her posture, reminded of her father's words that she should never surrender her rightful place to make others comfortable with their prejudice. Elizabeth Montgomery, the silver-haired woman across the aisle, continued to watch, her gaze steady and unreadable, her presence quiet yet significant, for she had seen enough in her life to know when an injustice was unfolding, and her role in this story would become pivotal before the journey was over. But for now, Amara stood there, a child with a secret empire, her story unknown to most in the cabin, her identity deliberately guarded to protect her from precisely the kind of dismissive scorn that Richard Blackwell was heaping upon her now. Earlier that morning, the truth of Amara's extraordinary life had been laid bare in the routines of her family home in Detroit. At 4:30 in the morning, while most children her age slept soundly clutching stuffed animals, Amara had been awake, her 3 computer monitors glowing as streams of code and financial projections flickered across the screens. Dreamscape had grown from a simple idea she coded in her bedroom at 9 years old into a global powerhouse adopted by schools worldwide, and though her shelves still held paperbacks and science fair ribbons, her work desk was a command center worthy of a Fortune 500 executive. Marcus had entered her room carrying 2 mugs, his steady presence grounding her nervous energy, and he had sat beside her as she confessed the truth of her anxiety that the venture capitalists they would meet in San Francisco were old school, men who expected someone who did not look like her, not a black girl with NASA pajamas and a stuffed penguin perched on her bed, but someone older, male, and white. Marcus had reminded her that today was not about proving she belonged, but about making them see that they needed her creation, and in his voice she had heard the certainty that had carried her through every challenge. That certainty sustained her now, standing in the aisle of a plane where she was being denied a seat she had rightfully purchased. To the passengers, she looked like any other child, but behind her guarded composure was the genius who had built algorithms that redefined digital education, the leader who managed a team of seasoned engineers, the innovator who had refused lucrative buyout offers from powerful firms that wanted to absorb her company. Marcus had left his own career as an electrical engineer to support his daughter's vision, transitioning from corporate life to the role of both father and executive support, and together they had learned to navigate the labyrinth of prejudice, skepticism, and disbelief that accompanied every step of Amara's journey. That morning at the airport, they had moved through security with practiced efficiency, their passports heavy with stamps from London, Tokyo, and Singapore, evidence of a life more global than most adults twice her age, and as they approached the gate, Marcus had reminded Amara of their backup plans for the presentation files, triple redundancies that symbolized not just preparation, but the necessity of anticipating obstacles. She had smiled nervously, and he had answered with steady reassurance. Now, with Richard's dismissive sneer and Sandra the flight attendant's wavering authority, those obstacles were no longer theoretical, they were standing in front of her in the form of prejudice made flesh. Amara could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of collective judgment pressing in. Some passengers looked sympathetic, others skeptical, but none intervened. It was Marcus who finally shifted the tone, his voice cutting through the murmurs with calm authority as he defended her right to the seat. For a moment, silence fell across the cabin, and in that silence the truth of who Amara was remained hidden. None of them knew that the young girl they sought to displace had founded a company valued in the billions. None knew that she was traveling to San Francisco not for a family vacation, but to secure an expansion deal that could transform access to education for children in underserved communities worldwide. None knew that her presence in 2A was not indulgence but necessity, that the comfort of first class had been deliberately chosen by her father to ensure she was rested and prepared for a presentation that might change lives. To them, she was only a black child, an intruder in their unspoken social order. Elizabeth Montgomery's eyes lingered on Marcus as he spoke, her expression shifting subtly as if she recognized something in his resolve. She said nothing, but her silence was not indifference. It was observation, calculation, the kind of quiet decision-making that hinted she would play a role larger than anyone could yet foresee. Meanwhile, Sandra hesitated, her training clashing with the messy reality of a racial dispute in first class. To push the man into economy was to challenge his privilege. To force Amara down was to perpetuate an injustice. The choice she leaned toward revealed more than she intended, and Amara felt it sting deeply. Still, she held herself tall, remembering her father's words, remembering the work she had done, the lives she had touched, the children her software had helped. She was more than what they saw, but she would not beg them to believe it. The truth about Amara Jenkins, the 11-year-old black billionaire who had just been humiliated in the first-class cabin by a man who believed she did not belong there, could only be fully understood by returning to where the day had begun, in the quiet pre-dawn hours of her family's home in Detroit. At 4:30 in the morning, the alarm chirped softly, though Amara was already awake, her sharp eyes fixed on the glow of 3 monitors arranged on her desk. The hum of the computer was a sound as familiar to her as a lullaby, the scrolling lines of code on the screen soothing her nerves even as her heart raced with anticipation. To anyone else, her bedroom might have seemed ordinary at first glance, with stuffed animals carefully arranged on a cushioned window seat, dog-eared paperbacks spilling from overfilled shelves, and a corkboard pinned with colorful ribbons from science fairs past. But the corner where her workstation stood told the real story, a story of brilliance and vision, of hours spent coding instead of playing, of a child who had become something much more than a child. Dreamscape, the platform she had created at the age of 9, had grown into a global educational tool used by schools across 47 countries to help students with learning challenges engage with their lessons. She had watched with pride as teachers reported transformations, as children once labeled as hopeless began to thrive with the adaptive features she had designed. Dreamscape had passed the billion-dollar valuation 6 months earlier, but she rarely thought about the money, she thought about the impact. Still, as she prepared for today's meeting with Suntsea Ventures, one of the most influential investment firms in the world, the weight of expectation pressed down on her small shoulders. Her father Marcus appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 steaming mugs, his tall frame silhouetted against the hall light. "Big day, Sparrow," he said, using the childhood nickname that had never lost its warmth. He handed her hot chocolate while he took his own coffee, sitting down on the edge of her bed and studying her face. He could always read her too easily, the way her fingers tucked hair behind her ears when she was nervous, the furrow that appeared between her brows when she felt doubt creeping in. "Nervous," she admitted quietly, clutching the mug. "They're old school, Dad. They're expecting someone different." He tilted his head, understanding what she meant without needing further explanation. Old school meant white, male, older, the kind of image people associated with billionaires and technology. Not a little black girl in NASA pajamas sitting on a bed surrounded by stuffed animals. "Then today is the day they learn something new," Marcus said simply. His calm strength anchored her, as it always did. He had once been an electrical engineer, but he had given up that career to support her vision full-time, moving from provider to partner, from teacher to supporter, and in many ways from father to colleague. Their lives were intertwined with the company, and their bond had only deepened through the struggles and triumphs they had faced together. "You're not walking into that room to prove you belong there," Marcus continued, his voice low but steady. "You're walking in because they need what you've built." She nodded slowly, drawing confidence from his certainty. He always made her feel as though her worth was unquestionable, even when the world constantly tried to undermine it. She glanced at the stuffed penguin sitting beside her pillow, a relic from her earliest years, and smiled faintly. The contrast between her youth and her accomplishments struck her often. Few would guess that algorithms born in this room had already changed millions of lives, that a girl still too young to drive had built a platform worth billions. "San Francisco, here we come," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. There was an unease she could not shake, a sense that something about this trip was different, though she could not yet place why. 2 hours later, they were at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, moving smoothly through security with the practiced rhythm of frequent travelers. Amara's passport bore stamps from Tokyo, London, Singapore, and dozens of other cities where she had pitched, presented, and signed agreements. She hated the constant travel sometimes, but she knew today's meeting mattered because Sant could help expand Dreamscape into underserved communities on a global scale. In the terminal, she suddenly paused, her eyes wide. "Dad, did you pack my thumb drive?" she asked urgently. Marcus tapped his chest pocket with a knowing smile. "Right here," he said. "And a backup in my carry-on, and another uploaded to the cloud. Triple redundancy, just like you taught me." Amara giggled softly, the tension breaking for just a moment. Their dynamic often shifted in such ways, the child reminding the parent, the father becoming the executive support to the CEO. It was seamless, a partnership of roles filled and exchanged as needed. At the gate, Amara reviewed her notes while Marcus called their driver in San Francisco to confirm their schedule. Around them, the airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Families corralling restless children, business travelers hammering away on laptops, solo passengers lost in books or headphones. No one paid them much attention, and that was how they liked it. Although Amara had been featured in tech magazines and blogs, Marcus had been careful to shield her from overexposure, wanting the focus on her work rather than her age or identity. When the boarding call crackled through the speakers, Marcus asked, "Ready, Sparrow?" His eyes conveyed more than just the question of whether she was ready to board. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders beneath the blazer tailored to her small frame, and nodded. "Ready." With her blazer neatly pressed over her NASA pajama top, tucked away in her bag, and her tablet clutched like armor, she approached the row that was supposed to be her sanctuary for the next few hours. Seat 2A gleamed in the soft glow of overhead lights, the leather cushion promising comfort, the window promising perspective, the space promising focus. Marcus, 3 rows back in economy, had reminded her that privilege was best understood when balanced with humility, which was why he had booked himself there. Amara knew his logic, but as she glanced back at him and caught his encouraging nod, she felt the pang of wanting him nearby, though she also understood he was teaching her something larger, that independence was as important as brilliance. Sliding into the seat, she adjusted the belt across her small waist, stowed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, and pulled out her notes. Around her, the cabin filled with passengers who gave her polite nods, some curious glances, and a few expressions that carried the subtle edge of confusion. A child in first class was always unusual, but a black child with sharp posture and the composure of a seasoned traveler was something many had never seen. Amara ignored the looks, focusing instead on the glowing words of her presentation slides, the numbers she had memorized, the phrases she had practiced aloud in front of her father and Zoe Washington, her COO. She was determined to make the investors see her vision rather than her age or her skin. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to lean back against the seat, her fingers running absently across the ridges of the boarding pass now tucked into her tablet case, and she closed her eyes, trying to steady her nerves. Behind her, Marcus settled into his economy seat, though he hardly noticed the cramped legroom or the bustle of passengers around him. His eyes flicked constantly to the small figure of his daughter, visible through the crack of the first-class divider. Pride and worry churned inside him in equal measure. Pride, because Amara was more than he could have ever imagined a child could be, a prodigy whose algorithms had changed lives, a leader who spoke with authority to men 4 times her age. Worry, because he knew too well the prejudice of the world, the subtle and overt ways it sought to push her down, and he feared that today, despite their careful preparation, despite their vigilance, someone would try to do it again. He reminded himself that Amara was stronger than she looked, that her mind was sharper than most, that he had taught her resilience, but the father in him could not quiet the unease. The boarding continued, a steady stream of travelers filing into their seats. A distinguished woman in her 60s sat across the aisle from Amara, offering her a warm smile. Amara smiled back, appreciating the gesture. Beside the woman, a younger man sank into his seat without a glance, earbuds in, absorbed in his phone. The atmosphere was calm, the low murmur of voices and the shuffle of bags creating the cocoon of white noise that often precedes takeoff. Amara felt herself relax slightly, her focus returning to the numbers and charts on her tablet, her pen scratching notes on her sketchpad as she fine-tuned ideas for features still in development. She was immersed in her world of innovation when a sudden disruption shattered the calm. A man rushed into the cabin, his expensive suit rumpled, his face flushed from haste. His eyes scanned the rows with irritation until they landed on Amara's. He stopped, boarding pass in hand, his lips pressed into a line. "Excuse me," he said sharply, "you're in my seat." Amara blinked in confusion, double-checked her ticket, and answered politely, "This is 2A. "It's my seat." The man frowned, his brow furrowing with indignation. His name was Richard Blackwell, though Amara did not yet know it. What she did know was the condescension in his tone, the disbelief in his eyes, the unspoken accusation that she did not belong there. He waved his boarding pass, insisting he had booked the seat. A flight attendant approached, Sandra Miles, her professional smile strained as she attempted to mediate. Amara handed over her ticket, her hand trembling but her voice steady. Sandra compared the passes and confirmed what Amara had already said. 2A belonged to Miss Jenkins. Richard's pass, however, showed 12C Economy Plus. The word economy exploded from his lips with outrage. "I've been a platinum member for 15 years. I don't fly economy. This has to be fixed." Sandra attempted to soothe him, but his gaze shifted to Amara with thinly veiled disdain. "Surely there's some flexibility here," he said slowly, deliberately. "Perhaps the young lady wouldn't mind relocating. I doubt she needs the workspace as urgently as I do." The implication was unmistakable, his tone dripping with condescension, and Amara felt the heat rising to her cheeks. She had experienced dismissal before, but it never lost its sting. For a fleeting second, she considered giving up the seat just to end the discomfort, but her father's words replayed in her head. "Never surrender your rightful place to make someone else comfortable with their prejudice." Before she could respond, the older woman across the aisle leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said pleasantly but firmly. "Perhaps I might offer my seat. That way, the young lady keeps her assigned place, and you, sir, remain in first class." Her gray eyes held Richard's with unflinching clarity, her smile polite, but edged with meaning. Richard hesitated, realizing the situation was drawing unwanted attention, that passengers were watching him with judgment. His indignation wavered, replaced by calculation, and he accepted her offer with forced gratitude. "Thank you," he said stiffly, while Amara whispered her thanks to the woman, who introduced herself as Elizabeth Montgomery. Elizabeth moved quietly to Economy Plus, and Richard sank into the aisle seat she vacated, his resentment palpable. Amara gave her father a small nod from across the divider, assuring him she was fine, though the encounter had left her unsettled. She could feel Richard's gaze, heavy and lingering, could sense the weight of his assumptions pressing down on her even now. What she did not know, what no one in the cabin knew, was that this confrontation was not the end of the disruption, but only its beginning. Within minutes, the echoes of this dispute would ripple outward, triggering events that would ground the plane, summon the FBI, and expose truths hidden for far too long. She could feel his eyes on her every few seconds, a sharp reminder that though she had retained her place, she had not been granted respect. Marcus Jenkins, seated a few rows back in economy, leaned slightly to the side so that he could catch sight of his daughter. He had witnessed just enough of the confrontation to understand its core. Once again, Amara had been judged not by her accomplishments, but by her appearance. The thought tightened his chest, but he knew she would not back down, because she had grown used to holding her ground even when it was uncomfortable. Richard sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, pretending to be absorbed in the contents of his laptop, but unable to ignore the girl beside him, who now sketched intricate diagrams on her tablet with quiet precision. Each line she drew reminded him of the seat he believed should have been his, and every glance around the cabin reminded him that others had seen him lose a battle to a child. Pride gnawed at him, yet deeper still was the unspoken prejudice he refused to name, the belief that she did not belong in this cabin, much less in a seat he had coveted for himself. His thoughts spiraled into irritation. What business did she really have in first class? What purpose could justify her presence here? And why had the crew not simply removed her when it would have been so easy? He wanted to believe this was a mistake, a disruption, an inconvenience, but beneath his reasoning simmered the simple truth that he could not accept a young black girl's right to take up space equal to his own. Amara sensed the tension, but refused to shrink from it. She opened her sketchbook, shifting from her presentation notes to one of her private projects, a design for a haptic feedback system meant to help visually impaired children navigate digital lessons. The pencil moved smoothly across the paper as she translated her vision into diagrams, and for a few moments the act of creation gave her peace. Still, her ears picked up every sigh Richard made, every exaggerated shuffle of his papers, every subtle attempt to remind her of his presence. The air around her was thick with silent challenge, and though she kept her face neutral, inside her mind raced with thoughts of how often she had been in similar situations, how often she had been dismissed or underestimated, and how her father had always taught her to meet prejudice with both dignity and determination. Sandra, the flight attendant, passed through the aisle again, her smile frozen in place, but her eyes betrayed the discomfort she felt at the situation. She knew Amara's ticket had been correct. She knew Richard's outrage had been misplaced, yet her instinct had been to suggest that the child move instead of the man. That truth unsettled her more than she cared to admit, and though she tried to bury the guilt under professionalism, she could feel the judgment of Elizabeth Montgomery's steady gray eyes on her from Economy Plus. Elizabeth had not intervened for recognition or praise, but her presence was a reminder that some passengers saw the injustice clearly even when the crew faltered. The other passengers had grown quiet, but the silence was not peace, it was tension, stretched taut. Some avoided eye contact altogether, preferring to bury themselves in their devices. Others cast furtive glances at Amara, curiosity and discomfort mixing in their expressions. A few seemed sympathetic, but none had spoken up before Elizabeth. Amara noticed all of it, filing the reactions away as if they were data points in one of her experiments. She knew silence could be as sharp as words, and the silence of the cabin told her that most people would rather look away than confront prejudice directly. Marcus's gaze never left his daughter, though he forced himself to sit back as if absorbed in his book. He had learned over the years that part of preparing Amara for the world was letting her fight her own battles, even when it hurt him to watch. He knew that every moment like this carved resilience into her character, but he also knew it left scars that no one could see. He thought back to the conversations they had had in the quiet of their home, the times she had confessed how exhausting it was to always feel the burden of proving herself, how she wanted sometimes just to be a child without expectation, without judgment. He had told her then, and he believed it now, that the world might not give her the benefit of doubt, but it could never take away her brilliance unless she let it. Elizabeth, now seated in Economy Plus beside Marcus by coincidence, leaned slightly toward him. "Your daughter handled herself well," she said quietly. Marcus gave her a small nod of gratitude, his voice low as he replied, "She shouldn't have had to handle it at all." Elizabeth's expression softened, but her eyes remained sharp. "No, she shouldn't have, but she did. And sometimes that makes all the difference." Marcus studied her briefly, sensing there was more to this woman than her polite words revealed, but the announcement of the final boarding call drew his attention back to the front of the cabin. She had learned long ago that people saw what they expected to see, and for Richard, she had been nothing more than a disruption to his comfort, a child intruding on what he believed was his rightful domain. Yet the truth of who she was simmered just beneath the surface, and though she did not announce it to the cabin, her very presence was proof that brilliance could not be contained by prejudice. Across the aisle, Richard busied himself with spreading out his laptop and papers, still seething from the embarrassment of being corrected and displaced, though his indignation was beginning to mix with something he could not name curiosity about the child who had refused to yield. Marcus Jenkins, seated in Economy, divided his attention between his book and the faint outline of his daughter's head visible over the top of the divider. His protective instincts sharpened after what he had witnessed. Elizabeth Montgomery, the older woman who had given up her seat, now sat beside Marcus by chance, her keen gray eyes missing nothing as she conversed quietly with him, probing gently into his life. Her questions cloaked in polite interest, but carrying the weight of someone who already understood more than she let on. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead as the plane reached cruising altitude, and Amara allowed herself to relax slightly. She pulled out her sketchbook, sketching circuits and interface layouts for a new project meant to give visually impaired students tactile ways to interact with digital lessons. The lines came easily to her pencil, the vision unfolding naturally, but she was aware of Richard glancing over more than once. His irritation began to falter when he realized what she was drawing. Curiosity tugged at him until he finally broke his silence. "That's an interesting approach," he muttered, his tone cautious but intrigued. Amara looked up, surprised, but answered steadily, "It's a haptic feedback system. I want to design something more intuitive for students who can't rely on sight." Richard raised his brows, taken aback by the clarity of her answer. He pressed, "For what application?" She hesitated, instinctively protective of her work, but then explained, "Educational technology for visually impaired students. Most tools are either too simple to engage them or too expensive to be widely available." Richard stared at her, the condescension in his eyes replaced by disbelief. "You're designing this yourself?" Amara nodded calmly. "I create the initial concepts. My team helps refine the technical specifications, but the core ideas are mine." He leaned back, stunned into silence, his assumptions shaken. He had thought her nothing more than a spoiled child, but the evidence of her mind was there on the page, undeniable. Before the fragile bridge forming between them could strengthen, the plane jolted violently, the cabin shuddering as turbulence rippled through the air. The seatbelt sign blinked to life again, and a flight attendant's voice urged everyone to remain seated. Amara gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles whitening, her face composed but her body betraying tension. She hated turbulence, though she rarely admitted it, and her breath quickened against her will. Richard, distracted by steadying his laptop, failed to notice, but someone else did. A woman in her early 30s, dressed in professional business attire, rose quickly from economy despite warnings to stay seated. She moved with urgency, pushing past the flight attendants until she reached Amara's row. "Amara," she called, her voice firm but reassuring. Amara looked up, relief flickering in her eyes. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Deep breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Amara followed the pattern, her breathing gradually steadying. The flight attendant Sandra hurried forward, frowning. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately. We're experiencing turbulence." The woman didn't move. "Just give me a moment. She has anxiety during turbulence." Sandra blinked in surprise. "Are you her mother?" The woman shook her head briskly. "No, I'm her chief operating officer, Zoe Washington. I work for her." The words dropped into the cabin like stones in water, sending ripples through the silence. Passengers turned to look, murmurs rising. Richard froze, his mouth slightly open, replaying the words in his head, "Works for her." He stared at Amara, his mind struggling to reconcile the girl he had dismissed with the revelation that she was a CEO, that this poised child had employees, executives, responsibilities that dwarfed his own. The irony stung sharply. He had demeaned her as a disruption, yet she was the reason Zoe Washington was on this flight, the reason Sunsea Ventures had prepared a boardroom in San Francisco, the reason Dreamscape existed. His arrogance felt suddenly small, his earlier insults echoing back at him with humiliating force. Zoe gave Amara's hand a final squeeze before returning to her seat, ignoring Sandra's continued protests. Amara mouthed a soft thank you, her gratitude mingled with embarrassment at the attention the episode had drawn. The whispers spread quickly among the passengers. "Did she say she's the COO? For the kid? Who is this girl? What kind of company would?" The fragmented questions hung in the air, but none of them found answers. Richard reached for his phone instinctively, forgetting that the plane's Wi-Fi was restricted, desperate to look up Amara Jenkins, to confirm what he was hearing. The rest of the cabin settled uneasily as the turbulence eased, but the revelation had altered the atmosphere. The girl in seat 2A was no longer simply a child. They now saw her differently, with confusion, disbelief, and in some cases reluctant respect. Marcus, watching from economy, caught the exchange and felt both pride and anger. Pride that his daughter's truth had been revealed, anger that it took a crisis for people to see her worth. Elizabeth Montgomery, beside him, had listened carefully, her eyes narrowing with interest. "She's remarkable," Elizabeth said quietly. Marcus gave a small nod. "She shouldn't have to prove it every time." Elizabeth's reply was measured, almost weary. "No, but sometimes proving it forces others to confront what they'd rather ignore." Her tone carried weight, the voice of someone who had lived through her own battles against prejudice. Up in first class, Richard's mind whirled with guilt. His nephew had dyslexia, and he remembered the program Dreamscape that had changed the boy's life, though he had never thought much about its origins. Now the pieces clicked together painfully. The child sitting across from him was the visionary behind it, the very platform his own family had benefited from, and he had tried to strip her of dignity simply because of who she was. Shame crept over him, though he tried to hide it behind the facade of busying himself with his papers again. He had dismissed Amara as a child, had tried to claim her seat, and had even demeaned her as unworthy, yet now he knew she was the CEO of Dreamscape, the platform that had transformed his own nephew's education. The contradiction gnawed at him like acid, but shame did not erase the damage he had done, nor did it prepare him for the storm that was about to descend on the entire plane. The chime of the seatbelt sign faded, and passengers resumed their quiet activities, the illusion of normalcy fragile and thin. Amara tucked her boarding pass into her case and tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. She knew from experience that once her identity was revealed, people no longer saw her as just a child, but as something both extraordinary and suspect, a paradox that weighed heavily on her. Richard's furtive glances only reinforced her unease, and she focused intently on her notes, trying to block him out. In economy, Marcus Jenkins kept a steady eye on the first-class cabin, his protective instincts heightened after the turbulence and the revelations. Beside him, Elizabeth Montgomery leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed, but her mind alert, her thoughts circling what she had observed and what it might mean. She had not revealed her own past yet, not to Marcus, not to Amara, but her presence on this flight was not accidental, and every development confirmed the suspicions she had carried with her since boarding in Detroit. A flight attendant named Michael approached quietly, his tablet in hand, his expression composed but carrying a tension that Amara, attuned to such cues, noticed immediately. He stopped beside her seat and bent slightly, speaking in a low tone. "Miss Jenkins, the captain would like to speak with you in the cockpit." Amara froze, confusion flooding her chest. "With me? Why?" Michael's answer was deliberately vague. "It's a routine matter, nothing to be concerned about, but the captain requested you specifically." Richard's head snapped up at the words, his curiosity piqued, but Amara felt the weight of every eye in the cabin turn toward her again. Slowly she gathered her things, slipping her tablet into its case, and rose, her legs trembling though she forced them to appear steady. She looked back toward economy instinctively, seeking her father's presence, and Marcus was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his tall frame moving quickly up the aisle. "If the captain wants my daughter, he'll have me as well," Marcus said firmly, his calm voice carrying an undercurrent of steel. At the cockpit door, Michael knocked in a coded pattern, and the door opened to reveal Captain James Sullivan, a veteran pilot whose weathered face carried both authority and caution. "Miss Jenkins, thank you for coming," he said formally, glancing at Marcus. "And Mr. Jenkins, I'm glad you're here as well. Please, step inside." The cockpit was compact, glowing with instruments, and the hum of navigation systems. First Officer Chen, a composed woman in her 40s, gave a brief nod before returning her focus to the controls. The captain closed the door behind them, ensuring privacy. "I've just received a communication from ground security at San Francisco International," Sullivan began without preamble. "It seems someone has called in a security concern specifically regarding you, Miss Jenkins." Amara blinked in disbelief. "A security concern? What kind of concern?" The captain's tone was measured, neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "The caller alleged that you are traveling under false pretenses and using fraudulent identification." The words struck Amara like a blow, her heart hammering in her chest. Marcus stiffened instantly, his voice low but tight with anger. "That's absurd. My daughter's documentation is legitimate, and she is exactly who she says, She Island." Sullivan raised a hand calmly. "I understand your frustration, but I am required to take all security alerts seriously, regardless of how improbable they may seem. The alert was specific, and I cannot ignore it." He turned to Amara. "What is the purpose of your visit to San Francisco?" Amara answered quickly, her voice clear despite her trembling hands. "I have a business meeting with Sunts Ventures. They're considering a major investment in my company, Dreamscape." Sullivan's brows lifted slightly, glancing between her and Marcus. "Your company?" Marcus interjected firmly. My daughter is the founder and CEO of Dreamscape Educational Technologies. She is here to present to their board." Sullivan absorbed this information, nodding slowly. "Do you have documentation to confirm this?" Amara pulled her tablet from her case, opening her passport, meeting confirmation emails, and presentation slides. "I also have my COO, Zoe Washington, on board. She can verify everything." The captain examined the passport carefully before returning it. "This appears in order, but the report was specific, alleging not only fraudulent identity, but also that Mr. Jenkins here is using his daughter as a front for questionable business activities." Marcus's eyes blazed. "That's not only false, it's offensive. Who made this claim?" Sullivan shook his head. "The call was anonymous, but it was placed about 20 minutes ago. That timing aligns with shortly after the seating dispute in first class." Amara's breath caught. "It was him," she whispered. "Richard Blackwell. The man who tried to take my seat." Sullivan did not confirm or deny, his professionalism unshaken. "I can't speculate on the source, but I must follow protocol. We've been instructed to divert to Oakland, where security personnel will board and verify identities and documentation." Amara's stomach dropped. "But my meeting will miss it." Sullivan's voice was firm but regretful. "Once a security protocol is activated, I have no authority to override it." Marcus placed a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder. "This is racial profiling," he said quietly but firmly. "You must see that." Sullivan met his gaze evenly. "What I see is a situation I'm required to handle according to procedure. My personal opinions don't change that. Prepare whatever documentation you have ready. It will help expedite the process." With that, the Jenkins were escorted back to their seats, Marcus seething with controlled anger, Amara fighting tears as she returned to 2A. Richard watched her approach, his curiosity morphing into unease as he noticed the grim set of her father's jaw and the way the flight attendant lingered near them. Before Amara could settle, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but chilling. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sullivan. Due to a security matter requiring attention, we will be diverting to Oakland International Airport. Security personnel will board upon arrival. We ask for your patience and cooperation." Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the cabin, passengers looking around anxiously, speculating about the nature of the alert. Richard's face drained of color as the words sank in, the realization of what he had set in motion dawning on him. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the accusing glances directed his way, though no one yet knew the truth. Amara sat stiffly, her small frame radiating dignity, despite the humiliation pressing down on her. She turned to Richard, her young face calm, but her eyes piercing. "Someone called in a false report about me," she said quietly, her words meant for him alone. "And I think you know who it was." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. The descent into Oakland carried a suffocating tension that wrapped itself around every passenger like an invisible weight, and though Captain Sullivan's calm voice had explained that the diversion was only precautionary, the looks of suspicion cast in Amara Jenkins' direction made it clear that many aboard had already drawn their own conclusions. The flashing lights of security vehicles waiting on the tarmac came into view through the small windows, their presence confirming that this was no routine diversion but a response to an accusation that cut deeper than simple procedure. Amara sat upright in seat 2A, her back stiff, her face composed with a dignity that belied her age, but inside her chest her heart pounded with the knowledge that one man's prejudice had spiraled into a storm, threatening everything she had built. Richard Blackwell avoided her gaze now, his earlier smugness transformed into a cold sweat of regret, yet he could not undo the call he had made during the turbulence, the call that branded an 11-year-old black girl as a potential threat. Marcus Jenkins leaned forward in economy, his hands clasped tightly, his jaw set with the kind of controlled fury that only a father protecting his child could contain. Beside him, Zoe Washington's thumbs flew across her phone despite flight attendants' admonitions to turn off devices, her text to Dreamscape's legal counsel already sent, her message to contacts in San Francisco drafted with precision born of years managing crises. Elizabeth Montgomery sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, but her gray eyes tracked every movement in the cabin, her thoughts connecting threads Marcus could not yet see. She had watched prejudice manifest before. She knew what power looked like when it hid behind procedure, and she sensed that this diversion was more than one man's spite. The landing was smooth, but the silence inside the aircraft was deafening. The passengers clutched their belongings as though bracing for an emergency, whispering to each other in urgent tones, casting furtive glances at Amara. Some were sympathetic, some judgmental, but all were unsettled. Amara kept her eyes on the window, watching the ground crew direct the plane toward a remote section of the airport, far from the bustling terminal. When the engines powered down and the main cabin door opened, 3 figures stepped aboard, 2 uniformed security officers and a woman in a dark suit whose authoritative bearing marked her immediately as federal. She introduced herself calmly as Special Agent Tanya Rodriguez of the FBI and requested to speak with Amara and Marcus in the galley. Sandra, the flight attendant who had mishandled the initial dispute, escorted them forward, her face pale with discomfort, as if belatedly realizing how the simple act of siding with Richard had set in motion something far greater. Amara rose with a composure that was now her armor, Marcus's hand steady on her shoulder as they moved down the narrow aisle. The eyes of every passenger followed them, some curious, some sympathetic, others hardened with quiet prejudice. Richard shrank into his seat, his pulse racing as Elizabeth Montgomery leaned slightly toward him, her voice low and sharp. "You did this," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Richard stammered, denying, but Elizabeth's gaze did not waver. "I watched you leave your seat during the turbulence. You made a call. You thought no one noticed." He sputtered excuses, insisting she was mistaken, but his words lacked conviction. Elizabeth's thin smile carried neither triumph nor pity, only a quiet demand. "Now you must live with the consequences." In the galley, Agent Rodriguez spoke directly to Amara and Marcus, her tone professional but not unkind. She explained that an anonymous tip had accused Dreamscape of financial improprieties, alleging that Marcus was using his daughter as a front for illegal activity. Marcus's fury threatened to break through his calm as he insisted the allegations were baseless, that their documentation was airtight, that this was a malicious attempt to sabotage his daughter's company. Amara presented her passport, her meeting confirmation emails, her presentation slides, even offering to call Zoe Washington forward as corroboration. Agent Rodriguez examined each carefully, acknowledging that they appeared legitimate, but explained that the specificity of the financial allegations required further inquiry. Marcus's voice grew cold as he declared that this was not coincidence, but a targeted attack, that prejudice had been weaponized into bureaucracy. Rodriguez, though bound by protocol, listened intently, her silence betraying an understanding of the injustice, even as her duty required her to proceed. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had curdled into anxious speculation. Passengers whispered theories about terrorism, fraud, child trafficking, wild guesses, rooted less in fact than in fear of the unknown. Amara's earlier poise, Richard's earlier outrage, the diversion itself all had painted a picture larger than reality, and rumor filled the void. Richard sat sweating, his stomach churning as he replayed the moment he had made the call, telling himself it had been business, that he had been protecting his priorities, but now recognizing the naked prejudice that had driven his impulse. Elizabeth watched him steadily, her voice again low. "Why?" she asked. "Why target a child?" Richard tried to argue that it had not been about her age or her race, but his own voice betrayed him, cracking under the weight of truth. Elizabeth shook her head, her tone icy. "The world is full of men who disguise their fear of being replaced as rational judgment. But that girl, that child, built something that terrifies you because it proves you were wrong about who deserves a seat in first class, in business, in life." Richard Blackwell sat frozen in his seat, his skin clammy, his heart pounding with the realization that what he had set in motion had spiraled beyond anything he had imagined, while Elizabeth Montgomery's calm eyes lingered on him with the sharpness of a blade, silently declaring that she saw him for what he was. Outside, Marcus kept his hand firmly on his daughter's shoulder, his protective instinct colliding with his fury at a system that so easily turned a false accusation into a public humiliation. Zoe walked with brisk determination, her phone in her hand, firing off instructions to Dreamscape's legal counsel and board contacts. Her role as COO expanded now into defender of both the company and the child at its helm. The ride to the Oakland FBI field office was a blur of silent streets and flashing lights. Amara stared out the window, watching the city pass by without really seeing it, her mind replaying the cabin, the faces, the whispers, The moment Zoe had declared herself her employee, the shock it had caused, and the moment the captain had explained the anonymous call. She had always known that her presence in the world would invite doubt, suspicion, and sometimes hostility, but she had never expected it to take the form of federal intervention mid-flight. Marcus sat beside her, his hand steady on hers, reminding her silently that she was not alone, that whatever storm had been unleashed could be weathered. Zoe spoke quietly into her phone, her words clipped, her tone fierce, ensuring that their attorney Diane Chen would meet them at the field office with documentation strong enough to dismantle the lies. The building loomed as the car pulled into a secure lot, a stark contrast to the luxury hotel and conference rooms Amara was accustomed to. They were ushered inside swiftly, the fluorescent lights glaring, the security checkpoints invasive but efficient. Agent Tanya Rodriguez remained professional, her manner calm and even, offering small courtesies that Marcus noticed and appreciated, though he did not trust the system she represented. Instead of an interrogation room, she led them to a conference space, polished table, glass walls, and folders neatly arranged, a gesture of respect perhaps, but still a reminder that they were under scrutiny. Amara sat down, her blazer crisp, her hair still neatly braided, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the exhaustion pressing against her poise. Marcus sat beside her, his eyes alert, his voice ready. Zoe placed her laptop on the table, prepared to defend every financial detail of Dreamscape's operations. Rodriguez introduced Special Agent Donovan from the Financial Crimes Division, a man whose tired face bore the imprint of years chasing white-collar schemes. He began without ceremony, opening a thick folder and explaining that the allegations concerned international transfers between Dreamscape's main operating accounts and offshore entities. His questions were precise, technical, meant to probe for inconsistencies. Marcus responded evenly, explaining the purpose of each transfer: global education initiatives, subsidized programs in developing nations, partnerships requiring currency conversion. Zoe supported him with documentation, citing SEC filings, audits, and quarterly reports. Amara listened intently, absorbing every detail, speaking only when directly asked, her young voice steady as she confirmed her role in decision-making, her understanding of the initiatives, her intent to expand Dreamscape's reach to underserved communities. 40 minutes into the questioning, the door opened and Diane Chen arrived, her presence shifting the balance instantly. Impeccably dressed, her briefcase heavy with evidence, her sharp gaze scanning the room, she introduced herself and requested a moment with her clients. The agent stepped out briefly, and Diane leaned across the table, her voice low but urgent. "This is worse than a simple false tip. The allegations are too specific. Someone with inside access to your structures is feeding information." Marcus's jaw clenched. Zoe asked sharply, "An insider?" Diane nodded grimly. "Possibly. Or a hack. But it's not just you. 3 other minority-founded startups have faced similar accusations before major funding rounds in the past 6 months. Each time, the companies were derailed temporarily by investigations that later found no wrongdoing. The common thread? They all refused buyout offers from TechCore Ventures. The name struck like a stone in water. Marcus remembered their overtures last year, the offer to acquire Dreamscape for a fraction of its value, the pressure that followed when he and Amara refused. Amara whispered the name quietly, her eyes narrowing. TechCore. Diane confirmed it. "Yes, this isn't about one man's prejudice alone. Richard Blackwell made the call that triggered this, but the financial allegations came from elsewhere. TechCore has been systematically targeting companies like yours, and there's more. Elizabeth Montgomery, the woman who gave up her seat, she resigned from TechCore yesterday, effective immediately. She's on your flight for a reason." Marcus's stomach turned at the realization. Elizabeth had observed everything, had asked pointed questions, had carried herself with the subtle authority of someone far more than a helpful stranger. Zoe cursed under her breath. "So she's either part of this or she's about to blow it open." Diane nodded. "She's a whistleblower. My sources confirm she's been gathering evidence for months." The agents returned, and Diane shifted into professional mode, presenting audited records, corroborating Marcus's explanations, dismantling each accusation methodically. Donovan listened, his skepticism softening as the documentation grew irrefutable. Rodriguez, observing quietly, registered the shift as well, her sympathy evident in her questions. After an hour, the tone of the room had changed. What began as suspicion of Dreamscape was becoming the outline of something far larger. A pattern of sabotage orchestrated by one of the most powerful firms in tech. Assistant Director Keller joined near the end, her authority evident, her tone brisk. "We've reviewed what Miss Chen provided. It aligns with other complaints we've begun to notice. We may be looking at systematic corporate espionage. You are free to go, but we will need to maintain contact as this develops." Relief flickered in Marcus's eyes, but he remained composed, thanking them, gathering Amara's documents, ready to shield her from more prying eyes. Zoe closed her laptop with a snap, her expression grim but satisfied that Dreamscape's integrity had held. Amara sat straighter, her fatigue momentarily lifted by the knowledge that their truth had been heard. Diane's voice cut through the quiet as they prepared to leave. "Elizabeth Montgomery isn't your enemy. She's about to hand the FBI everything they need to take TechCore down. But make no mistake, they won't fall quietly. You need allies, and Sunsea Ventures is your strongest card. Tomorrow's meeting will decide not only Dreamscape's future, but your ability to withstand what's coming." Outside, as they left the building under escort, the night air of Oakland wrapped around them, cool and sharp, the city lights blinking in the distance. Amara exhaled deeply, her breath fogging in the air, her father's arm firm around her shoulders. They had survived the humiliation of the plane, the suspicion of the cabin, the scrutiny of the FBI, and yet the battle was far from over. In the car back to San Francisco, Diane briefed them further, explaining Elizabeth's whistleblower status, the evidence she had already provided, and the likelihood that TechCore executives would soon face charges. Amara listened silently, her mind already shifting to the presentation she would deliver the next morning, understanding with painful clarity that the stakes were no longer just about investment or expansion, but about proving that her vision could withstand the full weight of prejudice and greed arrayed against it. The morning sun broke over San Francisco Bay with a brilliance that made the city skyline shimmer, as if determined to remind those who had endured the storm that light always returned after darkness. And inside the Jenkins Hotel suite, Amara Jenkins prepared with quiet resolve for the Sunsea Ventures board meeting that would determine whether Dreamscape's vision survived the sabotage meant to destroy it. The night before had ended in a flurry of strategy, documentation, and whispered reassurances, and now Amara stood before the mirror adjusting her blazer, her hair neatly braided, her small frame carrying the composure of someone far older, though she was still only 12. Marcus Jenkins, exhausted but unyielding, checked his notes, his protective gaze never straying far from his daughter, while Zoe Washington coordinated last-minute calls with their technical team, and Diane Chen reviewed legal documents with the sharpness of a blade. The ordeal at Oakland still clung to their bones, the memory of being escorted from the plane under suspicion, the whispers of passengers, the humiliation of one man's prejudice weaponized into federal intervention. Yet they carried themselves with dignity because dignity was all they had left to wield against a world eager to doubt them. The meeting itself unfolded with intensity. Amara presented Dreamscape's global expansion plan with precision, explaining how their adaptive learning technology would reach underserved schools across continents, how accessibility modules would support children with dyslexia and visual impairments, and how their valuation was rooted not only in profit, but in impact. At first, the board members studied her with skepticism, their eyes registering her age, her small hands gesturing over charts. But as her words flowed, their doubt shifted into recognition of brilliance. Marcus watched the subtle change with pride swelling in his chest, the moment when disbelief yielded to respect. Elizabeth Montgomery, now seated among the board as their newest member, listened intently, her gray eyes sharp but approving, her presence carrying the weight of someone who had walked away from TechCore's empire to ensure that voices like Amara's would not be silenced. When the board announced their decision to fund Dreamscape fully and publicly back them against TechCore's attacks, the room filled with quiet applause, restrained but meaningful, and Amara accepted the news with a graceful nod, holding her composure though her heart thundered with relief. They had won not only investment but validation, the kind of endorsement that no smear campaign could erase. The days that followed confirmed the tide had turned. The FBI announced a formal investigation into TechCore Ventures for corporate espionage, securities fraud, and conspiracy. Elizabeth Montgomery stepped forward as the whistleblower, releasing internal emails, memos, and financial records that proved the deliberate targeting of minority-founded companies. Richard Blackwell, stricken with guilt, came forward too, providing testimony about his role in the false alert, admitting that prejudice and corporate manipulation had influenced his actions, his shame laid bare before the law and the public. Amara did not celebrate his downfall, nor did she cling to bitterness. When she met him in San Francisco before returning to Detroit, she listened as he apologized with sincerity, his voice trembling. And then she did something he did not expect. She told him about the new features Dreamscape was releasing to support his nephew's learning. Her decision to offer that kindness was not forgiveness exactly, but a declaration that her mission was larger than vengeance, that the future of children mattered more than punishing those who had tried to diminish her. 6 months later, in Detroit's Community Innovation Center, the Global Access Initiative launched. Hundreds of teachers, technologists, parents, and children gathered to celebrate Dreamscape's expansion into 27 countries. Amara stood on stage, taller now, her presence commanding, her voice clear as she addressed the crowd. She spoke of the seat stolen on that flight, of the humiliation and suspicion, of the way prejudice had nearly derailed everything she had built, but she reframed it not as tragedy, but as testimony. What began as a dispute over a seat revealed the deeper truth about who was allowed to belong in spaces of power, she said, her eyes sweeping over the children in the front rows, many from backgrounds like her own. It revealed systems that resist change, but it also revealed something stronger: the resilience to stand firm, the allies who choose justice, and the unshakable belief that education should belong to everyone. Her words were met with thunderous applause, but what mattered most were the shining eyes of the children who saw in her proof that age, race, or circumstance did not define possibility. Marcus watched from the wings, pride swelling in his chest as he remembered the terrified girl clutching her boarding pass in seat 2A, her small voice insisting that she belonged. He thought of the turbulence, the humiliation, the walk down the airplane aisle flanked by agents, and how his daughter had borne it all with courage that many adults could not muster. He thought of Elizabeth Montgomery, sitting anonymously among the audience now, a quiet smile on her face as she witnessed the fruits of her risk. He thought even of Richard Blackwell, present at Amara's invitation, his posture humbled, his eyes contemplative, a man forced to confront the truth of his own prejudice, yet still given the chance to change. And he thought of Zoe, steadfast as ever, her loyalty unwavering, her determination proof that the work of building justice is never done alone. When Amara finished her speech, a young girl from the audience raised her hand and asked timidly what she should say to people who told her she was too young to code, too young to create. Amara smiled softly and replied with the wisdom carved from her journey. Tell them that age is only a number, not a limit. Show them your work. Let your creation speak louder than their doubts. Because the most powerful way to change minds is not through argument but through proof. The applause that followed was not just for her words but for the future they represented. The true end of the story was not in an FBI report or an investment contract, but in the lives of millions of children who would gain access to tools that opened doors once closed, in the shifting of a narrative that declared brilliance could come from anyone, anywhere, in the quiet dignity of a black girl who had refused to surrender her rightful place on an airplane seat and instead turned that stolen seat into a platform for justice. As the lights dimmed and the demonstration of Dreamscape's new features began, Marcus leaned close to his daughter and whispered the words he had spoken since she first began this journey. "Good job, Sparrow." Amara turned to him with a smile that was part child and part leader, her eyes bright with the conviction that their fight had only just begun. "We're just getting started," she replied, and in those words lay the promise of a future not defined by prejudice or fear, but by possibility. The end. If this story resonated with you, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the plot as it unfolded? Did the twist surprise you, or did you see them coming? And one more thing, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel across the world.